Hello and welcome to Primetime. Well, the Oireachtas Health Committee did a good job this week in hearing the oral submissions on abortion and doing it in a non-adversarial manner. But has anything been said this week which will alter the deeply held beliefs of the various sides in this issue? One of the key topics this week was how to handle the risk of suicide, and we'll debate that and the proposal for legislation with our panel in just a few minutes. First, with a look at what was said at Leinster House, here's Katie Hannon.
This week's Oireachtas hearings were the latest attempt to grapple with the most complex and thorny issue that has beset the national political landscape for decades. As the raft of medical, legal and ethical issues were parsed and analysed over the past 3 days, a number of common themes did emerge. There were the calls for legal clarity for doctors working at the coalface on one side, while on the other, much discussion about floodgates opening and slippery slopes.
They feel that once we put in some legislation, it will open the floodgates, and even if we don't do it in the first year, that they'll go to the courts and then they'll be able to do it 2 or 3 years down the line.
Just how real is this concern about these floodgates opening? The idea that legislation allowing for abortion in cases where there is a threat of suicide would lead to an extremely liberal abortion regime.
The X-case judgment potentially permits abortion up to birth. In addition, assurances that legislation will limit abortion to very specific circumstances are unreliable. Any such limitations will inevitably become subject to challenge in the courts.
Many point to the UK, where the 1967 Abortion Act, permitting terminations on 7 separate grounds, led to a very rapid increase in the number of abortion procedures there. Last year, over 196,000 abortions were carried out in England and Wales. 98% of those were certified on the statutory grounds of risk to the mental or physical health of the pregnant woman. But the committee was cautioned against making direct comparisons with the UK.
Perhaps the most controversial issue, and I bring it up now, is that issue of death during pregnancy as a result of suicide. Attempts have been made to confuse the risk of death from suicide by quoting UK figures relating to death from mental disorder, all mental disorders, not specifically. We are talking here specifically about the very small and tiny number of women who present wishing to take their life during pregnancy.
There was general agreement that suicide is a real, if rare, event in pregnancy, but considerable dispute over the issue of whether it could be properly diagnosed or indeed legislated for.
How good are we at predicting suicide? And the answer is we are not good at all. And that's not because we're incompetent. It's the inherent in suicide that it's very difficult to predict, because it consists of behaviour that's often unpredictable, and somebody might be suicidal one day and a few days later be perfectly well.
Another psychiatrist argued that experts were unaware of the reality on the ground, as young, pregnant, suicidal women were unlikely to present for specialist care.
If, for example, a woman or a young girl is suicidal because of an unwanted pregnancy, the last place she's going to go is to an obstetric unit and check in there and say, I'm pregnant.
It was argued that the hurdles that would have to be overcome would put off perhaps even legitimate cases from attempting to access an abortion service in this country.
It's actually going to be a very, very small group, in my view, who are going to be depressed, distressed, and who want an abortion and who want to access a process here. Because if they feel they have to go through a process of 2 psychiatrists and an obstetrician, and possibly appeal and possibly legal things, they're not going to come near us.
However, others were more concerned with the so-called slippery slope argument. The idea that any move to legislate for the direct and intentional killing of a fetus would be a major cultural shift that would have profound long-term consequences.
If you surrender the principle of the right to life of the unborn, that sends a message to society, which in turn produces a cultural change. Then other cultural questions emerge. What other rights will you overwhelm when their subjects are not very important? Some people refer to this as the slippery slope argument. Whatever you call it, it is certain that ideas like these have real consequences.
But a pro-choice campaigner said that a recent Red C opinion poll showed that public opinion is now strongly behind a more liberal abortion regime.
82% of voters supported a constitutional amendment to extend the right to abortion to all cases where the health of the mother is seriously threatened, and also in cases of rapes.
What bearing, if any, this week's hearings will have on the forthcoming legislation on abortion remains to be seen.
That was Katie Hannon reporting. With me now, Professor Veronica O'Keane, consultant psychiatrist at Trinity College and at Tala Hospital, Dr. Jacqueline Montuil, a consultant psychiatrist who works with
long-term consequences.
If you surrender the principle of the right to life of the unborn,
a consultant psychiatrist who works with Mayo Mental Health Services, Alva Smith from Action on X, and Maria Steen, who's a barrister and a board member of the Iona Institute. If we could just look at some of the figures from today's Red C poll, but it shows a majority of voters in support of the government's position, but it does suggest that for 1 in 4 voters, the inclusion of suicide is perhaps a step too far. Veronica O'Keane, could you address the concerns of those people?
Well, I think the issue of suicide is one that has confused a lot of people. First of all, the suicide is very rare in pregnancy, which doesn't mean, firstly, that we shouldn't legislate for it. Secondly, the majority of people who feel suicidal during pregnancy and who attend the perinatal psychiatry services, as given evidence by the 3 perinatal psychiatrists, can be treated for their mental health problems and can go on to make a good recovery and hopefully to have a healthy baby. However, there are some women, a very small minority of women with serious mental health problems, who do not want to continue with their pregnancy and who wish to terminate their pregnancy, and for whom the continuance of the pregnancy would represent a real risk to their lives. And there's a second group of women, and the second group of women are women who don't have any pre-existing mental health problems and who, because of an unwanted pregnancy, which could be caused by rape or which could be caused by what I guess essentially is a rape, but a young girl who is intoxicated and becomes pregnant in a state where she's not fully aware of what's happening. In these sort of cases, girls, and I've seen girls like this, they are actively suicidal. And this is what happened in the X case. She was actively suicidal. It's a real problem, and they don't have mental health problems beforehand. They become suicidal because they have an unwanted pregnancy. And in a case like that, and in a case like X, the treatment that she wanted was a termination of her pregnancy, and that would put an end to her suicidal ideation. And
And is your contention that that would help her?
Well, yes.
Yes.
It is.
Okay.
Yes.
Jacqueline Montuil, could you take some of the points raised there? And the issue of suicide has to be there, they would say, because it's at the centre of the X case, and however difficult it might be, it has to be legislated for.
Well, I think that's a fair point. And the most important thing about suicide and the treatment of suicidality is to make sure that it's evidence-based treatment. It's going to get the patient better from a psychological point of view, and it's going to make sure that any mental illness that is present is treated appropriately. The treatment for suicidality is not abortion. Abortion is not an evidence-based treatment. In fact, the research shows that the best it can do is has the same psychological outcome as if the patient went ahead with their unwanted pregnancy, but there are risk groups, including women who have had previous mental illness and also other risks, for example, violence in the home, a late abortion, where there's harmful psychological effects from abortion. And that's very important that we say this. As psychiatrists, we have to be seen to be giving evidence-based, appropriate psychiatric treatment and treat suicidality appropriately. The appropriate treatment is to make sure that woman is safe. Sometimes a woman that Veronica was talking about, you'd be thinking, is this woman safe enough to leave my office? Is she safe enough to go home? Are her family aware of how she's feeling? Is her husband or partner aware that she's feeling this way about the pregnancy? Or is she completely alone? Is she going to be safer if she's admitted to hospital? And if that's the case, we do that. Does she need psychological intervention that could actually be the most appropriate treatment at the time? Does she need medication if needed? And we do that all the time in our practice.
Well, what sort of an assessment are you making? Is it on a probability of suicide or a certainty or a very great likelihood of suicide?
It has been repeated that abortion is not a treatment for suicide, and nobody disagrees with that. Why it keeps coming up as a statement it's very puzzling. We all agree that abortion is not a treatment for suicide. Abortion is clearly a treatment for an unwanted pregnancy. That is what abortion is a treatment for. Or for a pregnancy that is in danger. Or for if a woman's life is in danger. That is what abortion is for. We manage suicide in different ways. If somebody is depressed, we manage suicide by managing the depression. And that's generally where psychiatry comes in. We treat depression, we treat mental illness, we treat psychosis. And in a sense, this whole debate is about women who do not have mental illness and who are suicidal because of a pregnancy. And it's in those cases where the risk to the life of the woman can only be averted by an abortion that we are talking about.
How might it be assessed, though, Veronica? And what system could you put in place that would be effective, would be speedy, would be compassionate, and would be in compliance with a pretty rigorous legislation?
Sure. Well, we assess risk all the time. For example, in the Mental Health Act, which was published in 2002, we were all trained in risk assessment for the Irish Mental Health Act. We all have been trained in working within that legislative framework in relation to risk assessment. The risk assessment we currently work within the framework of is a risk to oneself or to others. So this is what we do all the time. It's the bread and butter of psychiatry. We know how to risk assess. We've spent 6 years in college. We've spent 5 years getting our membership, a further 3 years in higher specialist training. You know, that is why we know how to assess risk. It's what we do. It's central to our profession, and we are absolutely competent in it. And
But you're not always sure, are you?
But one can never be sure in medicine. When you're talking about human health is unpredictable. But insofar as we can predict a probable risk, and this legislation is not about certitude, it's not about an immediate risk, it's about a probability of risk. That is what's quoted in the quoting from the expert group report.
Well, I think if I could possibly address that point, and that's the issue. If we're talking about women who've never had a psychiatric problem before, have an unwanted pregnancy, and now we're saying we're going to legislate in case they are suicidal in the future, we are not talking about acute and active suicidality. We're predicting a suicidal act that we cannot predict even when patients are severely psychiatrically ill. And the reason that may not be a bad thing is because we treat everybody who presents with suicidality with the appropriate psychiatric intervention. We treat them with counselling, with psychological intervention and with social support. And there's one other thing that Veronica said, which I think is absolutely not true, and that is to say that there's any woman presenting where the only treatment for her acute distress because of an unwanted pregnancy is abortion. First of all, abortion is a solution, a social solution, not a psychiatric treatment. There may be various coercive strengths on a young girl that you will only find when you do an appropriate and full, extensive psychiatric assessment. There are various psychodynamic reasons why a pregnancy might be very traumatic for a woman that we all know, we all learn that in our practice. And in the end of the day, we cannot even predict if somebody's acutely suicidal, if they'll commit suicide. What we want them to do is to engage with us for appropriate treatment so their suicidality reduces and that they're able to have their mental illness and distress treated appropriately.
But what is a psychiatrist to do if a woman comes in and says, I am suicidal, I feel like killing myself, and make a pretty convincing case for that statement? And if you treat them and if you find that you're not getting somewhere, and if you feel then, what am I to do? What are you to do?
Well, we deal with those situations all the time. If somebody comes in and says, I'm acutely suicidal, we say, well, we're going to make you as safe as possible and we're going to make sure that you get the appropriate treatment. I think perhaps what you're meaning is if the patient is saying, I'm suicidal because I'm pregnant. Now, the problem there is now we're looking to see if this country is going to say that the solution for pregnancy is an abortion and encase that in law, when that's not a psychiatric treatment, it's a social solution. And it's very important also that we're able to you talk about floodgates. We have to be honest about two things. Human nature is the same all over the world. And if you have a subjective symptom, which is what psychiatric symptoms are, we don't have blood tests that we can prove, for example, liver failure. As the medics are saying, we need to be protected. The medics can say this lady has organ failure. If she continues, her liver is going to fail, she's going to die. All we can say is this lady is saying she's acutely suicidal, but that suicidality can reduce. She may not be suicidal within a week with the appropriate support, and definitely if she has a mental illness responds to treatment. It's very important.
But not always. It's a big risk to take, isn't it?
No, it always does respond.
But perhaps not to the degree that you would wish.
No, it does. And that's the fallacy that's being discussed here. There is no problem that a suicide is an appropriate solution in life at all. I know that the pro-choice people are very much about protecting women's integrity in their bodies and be able to control their destinies. But no, psychiatric treatments work and are very effective. They just need time.
I just want to move it on to the more general discussion that was had in the Health Committee this week in the Oireachtas in the Senate. Alva Smith, It seemed as if the heat had been taken out of the argument. Would that suggest that perhaps there's a more mature approach to this, or are we going to see a sort of a more acrimonious, bitter dispute in the weeks ahead? Or are we making some ground here in the discussion at least?
Well, I think that what the 3 days of hearings have been extremely informative and very helpful, very instructive for, in a way, is the degree to which Irish society has shifted in its views on this particular issue and how it conducts its discourse and conversations about it. And I think certainly that there was much less of a sense of tension and of the kind of very stark and very unpleasant kind of divisiveness that I remember going back to 1983, for example. And you were quoting the poll, the Paddy Power Red Sea poll there, which shows that 2/3 of people in Ireland, 2/3 of those polled are now in favour of ex-case legislation, including suicide, and that has certainly gone up. It was, the previous poll they did was even higher. I think there were 85%. That was immediately after the tragic Galway case.
One of the ongoing concerns of those who are against this is this slippery slope argument, that it is open the floodgates, that you make it a little bit legal, it'll be a little bit more legal, and so on. How do you counter that?
Well, I think the talk of floodgates and slippery slopes and so on is sort of panic. It induces panic in people. But the reality, the blunt reality of the situation is that you could actually go back to 1967 and say that insofar as there was ever a floodgate or a flood or a slippery slope or whatever, that once the new abortion legislation came into operation in Britain, that Irish women did have the possibility to go, or women from Ireland had the possibility to go to the UK for abortion. And since that time, we have seen certainly an increase in the numbers of women who go to Britain over those years. But over the last few years, we've seen a decrease from about 6,000 a year to about 4,000 a year. So we don't have floodgates to be opened in a way here. What we have is a fairly predictable rate of abortion in this country, which is just simply not being performed in this country. And I think that actually it is time, and I definitely had the sense at the hearings, there is a much broader recognition that there is a major problem here which we have closed our eyes to for 20, even 30 years, and that it needs to be resolved.
I want to bring Maria Steen in on this notion of floodgates. Where's the evidence that a bit of legislation will result in yet more legislation and perhaps a change of attitudes further down the line?
Well, there's a couple of things, Richard. I suppose while the floodgates is a concern for some, for me, it's not the primary concern. The primary concern is the issue of legislating for the first time in the history of our country, to legislate for the direct and intentional killing of an unborn child. And that completely changes the landscape of medical practice in this country. So even if it's only one child a year who dies as a result of that, to me that's an unjust law and one that I do not want to see in this country. But it's interesting to note, and I think you're going to be covering it in a little bit more detail later on in the programme, about the right to die case. I just caught a little bit of it on the news, and I understand that the High Court made reference to the abuse of the right to die grounds in other jurisdictions. So they actually took cognizance of that fact. And we can draw a similar parallel with the abortion question as well here. There was also, I think, in the...
Sorry, how can you do that?
Well, in the clip that was made, in the clip that we had earlier with Dr. Rona Mahoney speaking, she talked about how that you couldn't, I suppose the analogy between the grounds for suicide and the grounds for mental health in England were completely different. They are different grounds, but that's not the point. The point is the principle of it, that people might be seen to bend the rules in order to obtain an abortion themselves. And it doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination. When we found out recently in an expose in the Irish Independent about abortion or crisis pregnancy agencies actually telling women to lie to their doctors that they had had an abortion, to tell their doctors that they had had a miscarriage, which could severely endanger their lives, according to the Master of the Rotunda. It doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination.
One of you wants to take that point. And quickly, because we're running...
It doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination.
lie and manipulate.
Okay, Albert, just let her finish the point and then I'll let you come in and we're running out of time.
It doesn't take a huge stretch of imagination. And I'm not saying that women would necessarily lie, but if we've seen the situation where crisis pregnancy agents are telling women to lie, women who are vulnerable.
Right. Take that point, whichever of you.
Well, first of all, I want to say that there is another parallel. There was a very interesting
Could you just,
point
because we're running out of time, we've about a
court
minute left, Alva, if you could just address that point specifically.
Of the individual. I have absolutely no reason, we have no evidence whatsoever to suppose that women lie more than men or men more than women, and particularly not in these situations. Absolutely. I don't think that we're talking about anything manipulative. The core of the issue here is that we have a Supreme Court ruling which says that where there is a real and substantial threat to the life of the mother, including suicide, we must legislate for it.
I'm afraid we can't, because we do have another discussion. There are people standing by and we're going to have to leave it there. But I'm very sorry, Jacqueline, we've run out of time. And we will come back to this again and we will have you on the programme to make that point. Thank you all very much indeed. Miriam.